Welcome to the State of Cyber War, a production of the CyAN Secure in Mind series of podcasts. Join us as we discuss international cybersecurity policy, information warfare, cyber defense, and how they affect the digital security of the world around us. Hi, and welcome back to the latest episode in the Cybersecurity Advisors Network's State of Cyber War podcast series, as well as video conversations. This is part of the CyAN's overall Secure in Mind network of interviews, recordings, panel discussions about topics related to cybersecurity. State of Cyber War is a collective effort between myself, John Salomon, as well as James Briscoe, the CyAN Secretary General. I'm based in Spain. James is in Finland. We both have backgrounds academically long ago in international relations and a bunch of random professional experience in various topics around cybersecurity. So what we decided to do one day is to start a podcast series talking about geopolitics, cybersecurity at a national level, how it influences entire populations, and mainly things that you may not necessarily treat in a corporate environment or that may not be covered in depth in the news. Today, we're going to talk about China and Chinese disinformation, as well as to some degree Taiwan. Taiwan is obviously a major concern of China's. It's part of their massive part of their international, or if you ask some members of the Chinese government, domestic policy. We're not going to go there. I think a good place to start off with would be with, James, what motivates China? What drives them?
Well,
nice question for you.
You want to start with? Yeah. I think at least it's pretty well documented and well established in this regard is that the main motivation at the moment is the reunification of China, and this is something that President Xi Jinping even stated in his New Year's address. He avoided any inflammatory remarks, but he did say that this was a main and continuing priority of the Chinese government, of the People Republic of China's government, and that this was something that they won't back down on. So this is a huge and primary motivator for them. And it's also somewhat of a personal mission for Xi. This is something that has long been a concern of his, and particularly it has some family ties, particularly back to his grandfather, coming from a political dynasty that he does. And so this is not just an existential, well, I would say an existential, but not just a driving mission for the nation, but also a driving mission for him personally.
I was about to say, when you mentioned his personal connection to this, that Xi is very frequently thought of as kind of want to take China back to some of its more traditional political roots, I guess. I mean, there's a lot of, I wouldn't say Maoist tendencies, but aspects of his governing style that harken back to the kind of more the early days of the CCP. What I also find really interesting, I'd like to talk about a whole wide variety of aspects of Chinese disinformation and propaganda, but what I find really interesting is in the Taiwan case also that in the Taiwanese situation, they've obviously got an election coming up very soon, maybe already as passed as of the time of this video being published. The two main adversarial parties are the Kuomintang, the former Chinese Nationalist Party, which obviously was kicked out of China in 1948, mainland China. Weirdly enough, they're the ones who are in favor of quote unquote dialogue and rapprochement with the Chinese, while the remind me again, I think it's not the Democratic People's Party, right?
Yeah, the DPP.
DPP are the ones that are more seen as pro-independence. Now there's always been kind of an unspoken, detente, or, we don't talk about independence very openly. We just kind of keep things as it is, kind of this messy balance. What I've seen is comments that Xi had to say, we're going to reunify China. It's just kind of the boilerplate everybody has to pay lip service to it. Does he really want to? I mean, we're seeing what the Chinese military is doing. There's a massive expansion, both numbers and capabilities. I mean, they've stated by 2030 they want to reunify. Is it going to happen?
Well, another easy question. I can't speak to whether or not it will happen. That's simply far too large and far too complicated. I think as to whether he wants it to happen, he absolutely does. It has, for a long time, it seemed as though there was more of a interest in just maintaining the status quo. And you have things like the 1992 consensus, which were unofficial gathering between the two governments. I think it was the CCP and the Kuomintang. But they more or less agreed on the what we see in Hong Kong, one country, two systems. Obviously now things have changed even since with how Hong Kong is being governed and China's dismissal of the terms of the treaty that they should be held to internationally. But also I think we've seen an emboldened China, and particularly a leader who takes this as a very personal mission. And so I think there absolutely is a drive. I also think there's a very acute awareness of the sensitivity of the issue, particularly in China, and the immediate consequences, particularly for trade, for a country that relies on so much international trade just to sustain itself. For instance, it would surely lose steel from Australia, which is one of its most important imports, and it's also the highest quality and the closest quality steel. So this
and
is,
I mean, one of the other aspects, I think, just in the steel side of things, even with you know, the very large ore carriers produced by Vale out of Brazil. I mean, that's you know, while it's a lower grade, it would be an alternative source of iron ore, but it's a little bit further away.
Yeah, and consequently, also easier to intercept. So these are huge concerns, and I think we're also seeing a reconfiguration of Chinese stratagem, because even in the recent months, whilst disinformation campaigns, particularly against Taiwan, have intensified in the lead up to the election, we've also seen a decrease in military flyovers by the Chinese. We've seen recalculations of these sorts of strategies in which they seem to have realized that if, I don't have a crystal ball, I don't have a direct line, but I think the idea seems to be that they've done this so much that it's just a part of daily life. There's no effect to these flyovers anymore. And so they've decreased these, but also picked up different tactics. And so I think this is also something that we've seen in the disinformation space, where there's been less overt aggressive push and less overt media tactics, and more in what I think can be termed as astroturfing with fake grassroots movements.
Well, what I want to get your thoughts on is so from my point of view, I would break down Chinese international motivations. And I think it's important to talk about the non-disinformation foundations of Chinese foreign policy or domestic policy before diving into the specific aspects of their disinformation campaigns, both domestically and abroad. And I would break it down to three general categories. Tell me what you think of this, right? The first one, domestic. Your 50 Cent Party, your vast network of volunteer and paid operatives that hang out on Tencent and WeChat and whatever, and basically try to keep dissent to a minimum, locally, before you even start arresting dissenting voices or doing whatever they do to them. You just basically try to discredit them and control the discourse. Second aspect, geopolitically, is China's backyard, or what they see as their backyard. The South China Sea with its oil resources, the Malacca Strait, you know, the shipping routes, the immediate neighborhood, their fishing fleets off the Philippines, the 7-dotted line or 9-dotted line, I think it is, sorry, in the South China Sea. And then further afield, we're talking about, I think what you're getting into with the Australian OR, as well as their, the Belt and Road Initiative internationally, this attempt to really kind of broaden and lock down their supply chains, build influence, as well as by influencing local governments and economic activity in Africa and South America. And at the same time, increasingly getting involved in, for example, disinformation campaigns in the US, in European countries, in Australia, whether it's to push a pro-China narrative or to destabilize perceived opponents, or perceived or real. Is that a kind of a reasonable breakdown? What do you think to that?
Yeah, I think that's a fairly reasonable breakdown. There's innumerable complexities to each of those considerations, but yeah, largely I'd agree. And I think probably the only thing I'd add at this stage is that I think we've been seeing increase, at least for the first ring that you mentioned, the domestic one, is that we've seen increasing sophistication over the years in terms of maintaining domestic control. But this is also something that's really only gathered speed with the latest generation, which has been a truly unprecedentedly patriotic generation in China. And this has been concern even for the government itself, in that they can't always control the fervor of the generation, and therefore that also pushes China into escalatory situations which they'd rather avoid. And so there's always been a certain amount of consideration of the population, but this is becoming increasingly so as time goes on.
So almost kind of a Red Guard recap, an online Red Guard where you're.
I didn't want to go that far, but yeah, an online Red Guard has a good ring to it.
Copyright that. No, I mean, but, for the idea, for those not familiar with it, the idea that you rile up youth essentially, and put them in this hyper patriotic fervor, but, whether by design or by accident, they eventually turn against a large number of their handlers. And you see the central government, the older generation, struggling to keep up with them, and having to then step up their own rhetoric and activities to avoid pissing off these more society.
And I can give one example. I can't remember the dates or the location, but, in the 2000s, there was an earthquake in China that was quite devastating. And Japan was actually going to provide aid, but this would have required JSDF craft to have actually landed in mainland China. And the internet outrage was so large about the possibility of Japanese military craft being in China for the first time since the end of World War II that China actually had to refuse Japanese aid in this case. Which would have been quicker than aid from a lot of other countries, and also could have saved lives. But really, the netizens said no.
Well, at the same time, speaking of natural disasters, I think one example that really blew me away was the sheer fury of disinformation. The ridiculous disinformation coming out of a lot of Chinese affiliated networks when the Americans had their big Hawaii fires last September. And there was a lot of activity on TikTok, on Facebook, Twitter, whatever, Twitter X, Twitter, as well as a lot of Chinese domestic channels accusing the US of using some kind of I think it was a secret weather weapon to cause these fires, right? So to what degree do you think that one thing that came to mind, I've seen interesting aspects of, if you recall the big Chinese spy balloon over North America, months ago, I believe it was February last year. A few weeks before that, there was a massive rail derailment in the US as well, which caused a big chemical spill. Now, this is before the spy balloon. Spy balloon was shot down. It's believe proven or widely accepted to be of Chinese origin. And all of a sudden, there's kind of a flurry of activity on focusing on the rail disaster that came to some degree after the weather balloon, the spy balloon, not a weather balloon, was shot down. I mention this because for me, these two cases are, I think, an interesting example of outright, blatantly false Chinese operations abroad. Now, the rail derailment thing was largely Russians, but with a lot of Chinese activity as well, as I understand it. Now, to what degree do these kinds of really blatant foreign operations or international operations, disinformation, lies, falsehoods, serve any of these 3 or 4 Chinese fundamental strategic goals that we were talking about just now? You know, do they help turn off voters to get the U.S. and its allies and, you know, the Quad or Five Eyes, whatever, out of China's backyard? Do they help, you know, give China a freer hand when it comes to Taiwan, the South China Sea? Do they help, you know, build up Chinese credibility or discredit its perceived opponents in Africa and elsewhere? Why are they doing this?
You're really softballing me today.
You're the one that's written all the papers on this topic. You're not getting away that easy.
No. So I think the answer is multifaceted. I think there's a lot of there's largely going to be different objectives per operation, but what I think in terms of signaling, there's a few possible objectives. I think you strike on an interesting point with African nations and other not typically aligned nations, and this is also something that we've seen through things like Belt and Road and also the Asia Investment Bank, is that China is really courting countries that have largely been left behind by the Western world and its allies, and showing that they are a true and reliable alternative in, at least that's how they're trying to position themselves, and that this is a new order that they're going to be able to lead the way to prosperity. And so showing that the once almighty and the United States is actually falling apart and is so scared that they're overreacting to the slightest of provocations in parentheses. So things like the weather balloon, the weather/spy balloon. I'm pretty sure that the CCP still maintains that it was just a civilian device that blew across the Pacific. And so whether or not there's any truth in that, they're able to just point to it and say, look, the US is so scared of us that they overreact to just a small balloon and they send a jet to shoot it down. And so...
And I have to apologize for saying weather balloon. It was a knee-jerk reaction because, you know, it's obviously a trope historically that whenever something is spotted that's in any way dodgy, it's immediately, no, it was a weather balloon. That's how effective this kind of disinformation or misinformation has become.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a really interesting thing that they've got going on here, because essentially we're seeing in the last week or so that there's been weather balloons floating over Taiwan that have been unannounced, and again the line is that they're just civilian devices. But what this does is that it creates a really interesting psychological game for the DPP, the current ruling party in Taiwan, in that it really means that they have nowhere to go. They're discredited either way, because one is that you've got these Chinese devices believed to be spy devices floating over Taiwanese airspace, therefore invading sovereign airspace. But they're just balloons. So the DPP looks like a fool and reactionary knee-jerk if they go shoot them down just like the US did. So either way, it plays into Chinese talking points, and particularly for trolls and troll armies like the 50 Cent Party, to really just say, look, they can't do anything, and if they do anything, they're stupid for doing something. So it's a really interesting position, and it's very well thought out and crafted, and it really plays on the tensions of the region very well.
And I mean, I think part of this is also that China has been tremendously stepping up its information / disinformation operations on social media. Now we have the ongoing debate about TikTok. Is it a Chinese affiliated, Chinese owned? Obviously it's Chinese owned, but is there a lot of Chinese influence there? There's one of the tropes is if you look at Chinese children's TikTok versus American children's or European children's TikTok, the content is completely different. Are they trying to, is this going down a conspiracy rabbit hole that the Chinese are trying to dumb down the quote unquote West youth? No, not a youth. I don't use TikTok. But one thing I did find extremely interesting is that Facebook / Meta announced last year that they had dismantled, at the time of the article that both of us found, 5 distinct Chinese fake account networks. Now, with regards to what, also both of us mentioned about Africa as an example, and this enhanced activity of Chinese operations on global social media platforms. So not your WeChats in China, not for domestic consumption. What I found really interesting is that very often the disinformation, the propaganda, echoes Russian disinfo. Now, I don't know about you, but my understanding is that Chinese approaches to geopolitics and Chinese motivations there's some overlap with Russia's, but it's a completely different approach. So I find it very interesting that they are tagging on to some of the Russian messages of the U.S. and its allies, and I hate to keep saying the U.S., but the U.S. and its allies are weak. They're uncoordinated, what you mentioned, right? They cannot respond coherently to developing situations. What is China doing here? We were there echoing basically Russian troll farms, but are they coordinating? Is it just distinct? Is it opportunistic?
I would say it's probably a bit of all three. I think there's certainly some overlap, but I think the realities are quite different. So we saw particularly with, and I do think that it's very opportunistic. So we see that, as I mentioned, and as I alluded to earlier on this call, that we have seen a pickup in what can be termed as maybe astroturfing and other different types of movements. They've sort of realized that there's obviously advantages to be had from overt operations. Meme warfare, we've seen great success even from the Ukraine about how they've been able to integrate memes to really bolster their standing around the world, and it's heralded as a great success of information warfare. And so I think the Russians have been taking cues from this, and I think the Chinese have as well. But we're also seeing this bleed over into really quite targeted instances that do rely on opportunity. So there are pro-Chinese and unification voices in Taiwan, for instance. And these people, if they're on chat shows, their clips will get taken, edited, and then blown up by fake Facebook accounts to make them seem far more relevant than they are. And they found that this is far more effective because at the end of the day, this is a Taiwanese person talking about these things. And oh, look, there's thousands of people agreeing with him or her. And so all over Facebook, which has a large Taiwanese user base because they don't typically use the Chinese Baidus and WeChats.
Is this something that you think is more? I mean, one thing that I came across was the United Front Work Department. This very, very established organ in China reporting directly to the Central Committee of the Communist Party that oversees a lot of the foreign information / disinformation campaigns as well as domestic activities. Is this something that's a coordinated campaign or coordinated campaigns, or is this something where you have, the Ministry of State Security, you have other actors, you have even, the online Red Guards going off the reservation doing this on their own? Now, this is a coordinated set of campaigns mostly, or?
I Can't say for certain, but I believe that it is, to be quite frank. And I think particularly on contentious topics like this, so like the Taiwanese election in a few days, I think that there would be some opportunistic trolls here and there. But I think for the most part that this would be coordinated disinformation.
That makes sense.
It seems
actor, yeah. It's really
exactly.
What's really interesting here, you mentioned Ukraine. That's a good one, actually. That's one of the, we have a few minutes left. China has repeatedly stated that they fully support the non-interference in sovereign nations' internal affairs, mainly as a keep your hands the hell off of what we're doing in our backyard, messaging. So there seems to be this kind of very ambiguous approach to how Russia is handling the Ukraine war. On the one hand, this is contrary to China's stated philosophy of non-intervention. On the other hand, it is, mucking with quote unquote Western, NATO, American, whatever military geopolitical dominance. And even though China doesn't recognize obviously Taiwan as a sovereign state, there is some definite, whether you want to call it hypocrisy or conflict with how China is actively interfering in Taiwanese domestic politics. Not to mention, arguably in, UK, German, American, whatever, mostly American via disinformation campaigns in their elections. So this is, I thought this was this really, there must be some mental gymnastics involved to be able to justify these kind of different approaches to different sovereign nations' domestic affairs. Do they not consider these kinds of influence operations to be interference? It's just kind of what one does.
I think it's probably a little bit of standard psychology. I think it's the whole idea of tribalism. And so you see that if we just use a general sweeping example, that if you as part of a political party observe corruption in another political party, you are hyper-focused on that and you're much more forgiving for corruption in your own party because it's like, well, they're doing it, so why can't we? And I think from the Chinese point of view, they are commonly pointing fingers all the time. This can be tactical, it can be, and of course, a broken clock is right twice a day. They do quite rightly point out hypocrisy in certain regards in other countries. And so I think it's very much just an idea of like, well, the US is meddling here and there. Why can't we? And I think the US famously interferes. You only have to look at the past 20 years, or even longer, really. But it's, I think from their point of view, it's really an idea of why can they do it, but why can't we?
Well, but this gets really crazy though when you start talking about like Australia or, okay, Japan, there's historical baggage, but Western Europe, for example, right? Which are, granted, a lot of Western European countries they were in China with the Boxer Rebellion and all that, so there is some history there. But I mean, Australia does not have a history of intervention with China. There is no real justification to meddle in Australian politics or this purely economic or geopolitical.
I think it's just the view that, you're exactly right. And I think it's just the view that, as an Australian, we're just a province of the empire. So we're fair game. So
very, very, very far southeast China.
Oh, I meant a province of the American empire.
So I was going to say that's, very far southwest.
The southernmost state. But that's the main it's not really justification, but that's the main explanation I can see to the hypocrisy. And it is a hypocrisy. But I think in their idea, it's just they continue to see themselves as an underdog and particularly an ascendant one.
It's that victim of Western imperialism mentality that's...
Well, yeah, the 100 years of humiliation and things like that.
Yeah. So the West is kind of seen as almost a monolithic block that has continued to keep China down, keep it from fulfilling its potential, which in turn I think goes into this whole economic idea of, well, we want our place in the world. We, China strong. We are a strong economic, credible actor. We want to have geopolitics. We want a stable society at home. So we're going to go after anything that prevents us from getting to where we ought to be, or we feel we ought to be.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's as you said, they're a rational actor. And I think that's the simplest rationalization that we can give for a lot of the activities that we see. There's differences in terms of how they conceptualize a lot of things. If we start a book club on this, I think one of the best starting points for this is Kevin Rudd's Avoidable War, the former Prime Minister of Australia, and one of the only Mandarin-speaking world leaders who is now the current ambassador to the United States. He does an excellent job of breaking down some different Chinese conceptualizations just at the base level, and then also his dealings with Xi Jinping from when he was just the mayor of Shanghai, I think, from memory, and going forward. So great book, but I think to bring it back, it's the rationalizations that we see are exactly what you say.
And I think it's good to keep in mind what, the cui bono is always, who benefits is always the fundamental, starting point for identifying and dealing with disinfo. With that, we're coming up on time.
Yeah, I'd love to do a follow up.
We will.
We'll have more to say on particularly Taiwan. They've said that they'll release their analysis of interference after the election. So I think
we'll be able to treat it with the benefit of hindsight as well. Yeah. Let's see how it comes out. Cross our fingers for our Taiwanese friends. And we will womp much more. We will wade much more deeply into the wild and wacky swamp of disinformation and election interference on one of our near future episodes. With that said, thanks very much, James, as usual. Wish you a very, very happy rest of the week. Don't forget to visit us at cybersecurityadvisors.network. Just want to reiterate, this is a bunch of amateurs talking geopolitics and international cybersecurity. We're going to put a bunch of links in the video description. I also want to do a very, very strong plug for our friends over at the Natto Thoughts Substack, whose 3-part disinformation handbook has been an absolutely invaluable resource. Check that out. They have a bunch of links in there as well. A bit of a longer read if you have a long train ride in front of you. And with that said, I'll see you next week for the next one. Take care, James.
Thanks, John. Bye-bye.
Thank you for joining us in this latest edition of the Secure in Mind podcast series, courtesy of the Cybersecurity Advisors Network. Visit us at cybersecurityadvisors.network/media and /blog for additional episodes and articles. Follow us on LinkedIn, YouTube, SoundCloud, Podcast Republic, and iTunes, and don't hesitate to get in touch. Stay safe, stay smart, stay educated, and stay secure. and how they affect the digital security of the world around us.